Think about the person at your corporate job that everybody gets along with. Doesn't matter if it's an office, a warehouse, a restaurant, a hospital, a construction site. Every workplace has one. The person who never starts drama, who covers shifts without complaining, who remembers people's names, asks how your weekend was, and actually listens to the answer. The person who, if you took a vote right now, would win most liked without a second thought. Now ask yourself, when was the last time that person got promoted? Because here's what most people assume. If you're good to people, people will be good back to you. If you make yourself easy to work with, you make yourself hard to lose. That if enough people like having you around, you'll be protected when things get difficult. That assumption is costing people more than they realize. Here's what's actually happening. Somewhere along the way, a lot of people made a quiet, almost unconscious decision. They decided that being well-liked was the same thing as being valuable. That if people enjoyed having them around, if they were easy, warm, agreeable, that would translate into career security. It doesn't. And the cost isn't just emotional, it's concrete. It shows up in who gets passed over for promotion. It shows up in who's the last to know about an opportunity. Most people who fall into this pattern are genuinely good at their jobs. They just built the wrong kind of presence, and nobody told them the difference. Let me walk you through how this actually works. You start a new role. You want to settle in, build relationships, not step on anyone's toes. That's reasonable. So you focus on getting along. You help people. You pick up the slack without being asked. You stay out of the politics. You let things go that maybe you shouldn't let go because you don't want to be seen as difficult. And it works. People like you. Your manager thinks you're easy to manage. Your colleagues enjoy working with you. You get described in performance reviews with words like collaborative and reliable and a pleasure to work with. Now here's where the mechanism kicks in. Those words feel like praise. They are praise. But they're a specific kind of praise, the kind that describes how you make other people feel, not what you actually produce or move or change. And over time, without realizing it, you've allowed your reputation to be built entirely on the first category. Someone asks your manager, "Can we count on Danny for this?" And your manager says, "Oh, Danny is great, very dependable, good with the team." What they didn't say, what they maybe couldn't say, is, "Danny is the person we call when something impossible needs to happen." Those are two different sentences, and the distance between them is larger than most people realize. Here's another version of the same pattern. There's a decision being made. Budget, headcount, strategy. You're not in the room. But people who are in the room are being asked to rank priorities. And the way that ranking happens isn't based on who people like. It's based on who they can point to and say, "If we lose this person, here is specifically what breaks." Your likability is not a specific thing that breaks. It's ambient. It diffuses. It doesn't survive that conversation. And one more, there's a reorg coming. Your company is trimming layers. The people who make those calls are often not the people you've spent 2 years building warmth with. They're looking at a spreadsheet. They're looking at outcomes. They're looking at who owns what. And the person who was everyone's favorite, the one who smoothed every room they walked into, doesn't show up differently on that spreadsheet than the person who kept their head down and said nothing. Both of them become a line item. Here's what makes this particularly hard to undo. The longer you operate this way, the more you get sorted into a specific box in people's minds. And once you're in that box, you stop getting considered for things that would require you to be seen differently. You don't get brought into the high-stakes decisions. Not because people don't trust you. They do trust you. They trust you to be pleasant and agreeable and to not create friction. That's exactly the problem. High-stakes decisions require friction. They require someone who will push back, flag what's wrong, say the uncomfortable thing out loud. And if your entire track record is one of smoothing things over, you don't get invited into the room where the rough edges are. So you keep being invited to the meetings where your social ease is useful, the team lunch, the onboarding, the morale committee, and you stay out of the meetings that build actual leverage. Meanwhile, something else happens. An identity starts to form, not the one you'd choose, but the one your behavior keeps confirming. You become the person who is good with people. That becomes your primary professional identity, and everything else you bring, your analysis, your judgment, your actual expertise, gets filtered through that lens. People start to see your skills as secondary to your warmth, and that's a category you did not put yourself in intentionally, but you're in it. And here's what makes it compound. You're probably not unhappy. You're liked. People are nice to you. Work isn't miserable. So there's no sharp signal telling you something is wrong. The cost of this pattern doesn't show up every day. It shows up in the 3-year arc, the 5-year arc. It shows up when you look around and realize that several people who joined after you are now operating at a level you haven't reached, what some psychologists call a career plateau, a ceiling that feels invisible because nobody put it there deliberately. And when you try to trace back why, the answer is slippery. Nobody wronged you. Nobody was unkind. You were just held in place, comfortably. And for the colleagues who watch a restructuring happen around them, there's a separate cost. What psychologists call survivor syndrome, the disorientation of remaining while others are let go, hits hardest the people who never built a clear case for their own indispensability. They survive, but they're not sure why. And that uncertainty doesn't go away. There's a gap between what you see and what the people making decisions about your career actually see. And most people never close that gap, not because they're not trying, but because nobody ever tells them the gap exists. Here's what you see when you look at your own situation. You see relationships. You see years of goodwill. You see a track record of never causing problems. You see that people would genuinely miss you if you left. That feels like equity. It feels like something you've earned, and that will protect you when things get hard. Here's what a decision maker sees when they look at your file. They see someone whose value is hard to quantify. And in a world where things are being cut or reorganized, hard to quantify is not a protection. It's a liability. Researchers at Harvard Business Review have written about this directly. The distinction between being liked and being valued is one of the most consistent blind spots in how professionals assess their own standing. The people who survive restructurings and get promoted in uncertain environments tend to have something in common, not charisma, not performance scores. What they have is clarity of ownership. There is a thing, a result, a number, a system, a relationship with a client, a piece of the business, where if you ask who owns this, the answer is clearly them, not their team. Them, and that ownership is legible. It can be pointed to. It can be argued for in a room that person is not in. Likability is not ownership. Cooperativeness is not ownership. Even competence, distributed evenly across every request that comes your way, is not ownership. It is contribution without claim. And here's the part that's hardest to sit with. The people making decisions about your career are often not evaluating you based on your effort or your intentions. They're evaluating you based on what story they can tell about you in a room where you're not present. We need to keep her because what comes after that sentence? What's the concrete, specific reason? If the most honest answer is people really enjoy working with her, that sentence does not hold up under budget pressure. It just doesn't. This is not an indictment of being a decent human being at work. You should be a decent human being at work. But decency is the floor, not the ceiling. And a lot of people built their entire professional strategy on something that was only ever meant to be the starting point. So what do people who avoid this trap actually do differently? The first thing is they get specific about what they own, not what they contribute to, what they own. There is a meaningful difference. Contributing means you're part of the effort. Owning means if you weren't there, this specific thing would not happen, or would happen worse. People who build durable careers identify one or two areas where that is genuinely true, and they make sure that ownership is visible. They talk about it directly. They report on it. They connect it to outcomes the organization cares about. The second thing is they learn to be strategically uncomfortable. They don't stop being pleasant. Pleasantness is not the problem, but they practice the skill of introducing friction where friction is warranted. They say the thing in the meeting that nobody else will say. They push back on a decision with a reasoned alternative. They write the memo that challenges the direction, and they do it calmly, without drama. Not to be difficult, but because being willing to be uncomfortable in service of something real is how you signal that you're operating at a level where decisions live, not just in the comfortable zone where execution lives. The third thing is they build the right kind of relationships, not wide ones, deep ones. A lot of people who are universally liked have shallow relationships everywhere. They're warm with everyone and close to no one. The people who build real career protection have 2 or 3 relationships with people who have genuine decision-making authority and who can speak to their specific value from first-hand experience. Career researchers make a pointed distinction here between a mentor and a sponsor. A mentor gives you advice. A sponsor, what leadership researchers specifically define as someone with power who advocates for you when you're not in the room, is a different thing entirely. One sponsor who will say your name when a real opportunity opens up is worth more than 20 colleagues who would feel sad if you left. And the fourth thing, maybe the most important, is they stop treating visibility as vanity. A lot of likable, hardworking people stay quiet about their results because they don't want to seem like they're self-promoting. That restraint costs them. The work doesn't speak for itself. The work speaks when you give it a voice. That means writing up what you accomplished and why it mattered. That means asking for the stretch assignment out loud instead of waiting to be noticed. That means making your reasoning visible in meetings instead of just your agreeableness. Robert Cialdini, whose research on influence and persuasion is foundational to this space, identified likability as one of the core levers of human behavior. But his point was never that being liked was enough. His point was that likability opens the door. You still have to walk through it with something real. None of this requires you to become someone you're not. It requires you to take the things you're already doing and make sure they register. Here's the tension at the center of all of this. Being liked feels like security, and in many ways it is. It makes your day easier. It keeps your environment manageable. It removes a lot of friction from the moment-to-moment experience of being at work. That's real. That has value. But it is not the same as being protected. And the distinction matters most when things change. When a company hits a rough quarter. When a new leader comes in with different priorities. When 2 people are being considered for the same role and someone has to choose. In those moments, warmth doesn't travel well. It doesn't survive the conversation that happens without you. What survives is specificity. What survives is a track record that can be pointed to, a result that can be named, an argument that can be made on your behalf by someone who isn't you. Most people, when they hear this, will nod. They'll think about the person they know who operates this way, the one who seems a little more direct, a little more willing to claim space, a little less worried about whether everyone in the room is comfortable. And they'll have a thought that sounds something like, I should probably do more of that. And then they'll go back to work. And the next time there's a moment of low-stakes friction, a meeting where they could push back but don't, a conversation where they could assert ownership but soften it, they'll choose the comfortable option. Not because they're weak, because it costs them nothing in that specific moment. The cost doesn't come due until much later. That's the real trap. Not that people don't understand it. Most people, when it's laid out clearly, understand it just fine. The trap is that the wrong behavior pays off every day in small ways. and the right behavior is uncomfortable for a long time before it starts to pay. So you already know what this means. The question is just whether you're going to do something with it.